He sat alone in that dimly lit room, eyes fixed on the flickering candle in front of him. The world knew Mel Gibson as the face of Hollywood rebellion, the man who brought ancient stories to life and dared to touch the sacred with his camera. But few knew of the night that changed his understanding of faith forever. It wasn't in Los Angeles. It wasn't on any red carpet. It was somewhere deep in the desert, far from the noise of fame. He was traveling through Jordan for what he claimed was a private research project. No cameras, no assistants, just silence and the weight of his thoughts. Locals had told him about an old scholar who lived near the ruins of Petra, a man whose words were said to change the hearts of the arrogant. Mel laughed at that description at first, but something in his chest wouldn't let him ignore it. He had spent years portraying pain, sacrifice, and divine struggle on screen, yet he had never felt the real essence of it when he finally met the scholar. The man was sitting on a carpet, reciting softly from a book whose words seemed to breathe through the air. Mel didn't understand a single word, but the sound shook something deep inside him. It wasn't the music of the words. It was the stillness they carried. The scholar stopped, looked up, and said calmly, "You came here to film history, but history is already filming you for a moment." The Hollywood star froze. The air around him felt heavier. Mel asked through a translator what the old man meant. The scholar smiled and replied, "You have shown the suffering of men on crosses, but you never showed the peace that comes when a man bows." Those words echoed in his mind. For days he couldn't sleep. At night he'd wander out under the desert sky, staring up at the same stars that once guided prophets. Somewhere between exhaustion and wonder, he began to feel something unfamiliar. Humility. It wasn't the kind taught in churches or award ceremonies. It was the kind that grows when a man realizes how small he really is. He stayed there longer than planned. The villagers grew to like him. A man of fame who ate with his hands, who removed his shoes before entering a humble tent. He listened to the evening call to prayer, the way it rolled through the hills like a haunting melody. Every time the voice began, he'd stop whatever he was doing, standing quietly until it faded into the night. Someone once asked him why he paused. He simply said, "Because that sound feels closer to God than anything I've heard in my life." One night, during a sandstorm, the power went out across the small village. Mel sat with the scholar in silence, the only light coming from a lantern between them. The scholar began to speak again, his voice calm, steady. "You have told stories of the son of Mary." He said, "But did you know we love him too?" Mel's eyes widened. He thought it was a trick of translation. But no, the man went on, reciting verses that spoke of Jesus not as an enemy, but as a beloved prophet. That night shattered his certainty. The boundaries he had built between his faith and theirs dissolved into dust. There was reverence here, not for fame, not for gold, not for screens, but for something unseen, eternal. When Mel returned to the West, something in him had changed. He didn't talk much about it, but people close to him noticed. The anger that once flared in interviews was replaced by quiet pauses. During one podcast appearance years later, when asked about religion, he took a long breath before answering. He said slowly, "There's a kind of discipline, a kind of peace in Islam that the West doesn't understand. It's not just religion. It's rhythm. It's submission to something higher." The host was stunned. The room fell silent. He wasn't defending. He wasn't converting. He was respecting truly deeply. Later that evening, when the cameras were off, someone asked him what he really saw out there in the desert. He smiled faintly, eyes distant, as if watching an old memory. "I saw men who had nothing," he said, "but still thanked God 5 times a day. I saw faces that glowed in the dark without any spotlight. I saw peace, the kind that doesn't need to be filmed." There was something almost painful in the way he said it, like a man who had tasted a truth too heavy to carry back home. He once confessed privately that the verse he heard that first night never left him. He couldn't recite it perfectly, but he remembered the meaning. Indeed, in the remembrance of God, hearts find rest. And maybe that's what he had been searching for all along. Rest, not fame, not glory, not applause, just rest. Years later, when reporters tried to question him about his sympathy toward Islam, he never denied it. He simply said, "You respect what you understand, and I understood something sacred." Some say he still keeps that same worn-out copy of the Qur'an the scholar gave him, wrapped in a cloth, untouched but never forgotten. Others say he sometimes plays the sound of the call to prayer before he writes, a reminder of the night when the desert whispered truths louder than Hollywood ever could. And maybe in that stillness, Mel Gibson found something most of us spend a lifetime chasing, a moment of divine silence where the ego dies and the soul finally listens. He never told anyone about the night that followed, the one that tore him apart quietly, piece by piece, until only truth remained. It began not with thunder, not with light, but with a dream. One of those dreams that feels more like a memory than imagination. Mel said later it was as if he was walking barefoot through endless sand, the air heavy, the horizon burning with a golden haze. And there, in that endless silence, he saw a figure. Not of flesh, not a shadow, just presence. The figure said nothing. It only turned slowly and pointed toward the ground. Mel looked down and saw words written in the sand, words he couldn't read but could somehow understand. They meant the truth was always here. You just looked too high to see it. He woke up trembling, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his chest. The desert was still. The call to Fajr prayer began somewhere far away. The same haunting voice rising like smoke into the dawn. He sat up, eyes wet. Not from fear, but from a strange kind of peace that hurt more than pain itself. It was as if something inside him had broken open. When morning came, he found the old scholar waiting by the door of his tent. The man looked at him with the calm of someone who already knew. "You saw it," he said softly. Mel didn't answer. He just nodded. The scholar smiled faintly. "Dreams are not lies," he said. They are messages to those who listen. That day, Mel walked for hours through the ruins of Petra. The ancient stone walls glowed under the desert sun, red gold alive. He ran his hands along them, feeling the weight of time, the pulse of forgotten civilizations. And in that silence, he whispered, how many people have searched for God in stone and temples, in power, and missed him in humility? He stayed by the ruins until sunset. The world turned orange, then crimson. He thought of the films he had made, the blood, the violence, the noise. He realized he had spent his life showing man's suffering, but never his surrender. The scholar's words echoed again. You showed men on crosses, but never those who bowed. That night he returned to the village. The people were preparing food, laughing softly around a fire. Children chased each other barefoot in the dust. An old woman offered him tea, sweet black, burning hot. He thanked her with a nod, sitting down beside the fire. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stranger. As the flames flickered, one of the villagers asked him, why do people in your country always make our faith look dark? The question struck him hard. He wanted to answer, but his voice failed. After a long pause, he said quietly, because they fear what they don't understand, and because understanding takes silence, not cameras. The man nodded, poking the fire with a stick. Sparks rose into the air like small stars. You have the power to show truth, the man said, but power is a dangerous friend. That night, Mel couldn't sleep again. He sat outside watching the stars fade as dawn approached. He thought about the truth, how fragile it was, how easily twisted when wrapped in ambition. He remembered the scholar's words from days earlier. History is already filming you. By the time he left Jordan, something irreversible had happened. He didn't tell anyone about the scholar, the dream, or the verses, but he carried them with him, in the pauses between words and the silence after applause. In the way he began to look at the world differently. When he returned to Hollywood, everything felt colder. The lights, the noise, the hollow smiles. His mansion felt like a cage. He tried to write again, to lose himself in scripts, but every word seemed meaningless. He began to question everything, the roles he played, the faith he practiced, the people he trusted. He started reading, not the scripts of others, but scriptures of faiths he had once ignored. The Quran sat on his desk, wrapped in the same cloth the scholar had given him. He'd read it in fragments, often stopping mid-verse, lost in thought. Sometimes he'd read the same line over and over again, and whoever humbles himself before God, he will raise him high. It felt like the desert was speaking again, but this time through paper and ink. He grew quieter in interviews. The old fire in his voice softened. When asked about religion, he no longer spoke like a preacher. He spoke like a man who had seen something too sacred for argument. Faith isn't about choosing sides, he said once. It's about recognizing truth wherever it hides. But not everyone welcomed that change. The more he spoke with calm, the louder the world accused him of confusion. The tabloids twisted his words. Old controversies were dragged back into the spotlight. His friends whispered that he was straying too far. He received letters, some praising him for his open heart, others calling him a traitor to his faith. The storm around him grew. Yet inside, he found peace. There was one particular night that no one knew about. It was years after his visit to the desert. He had been invited to a private event, a charity dinner hosted by religious leaders from around the world. He almost didn't go, but something compelled him. Halfway through the evening, a young man approached him. He introduced himself as Yusuf, an Islamic scholar visiting from Egypt. His eyes were calm, steady, the same kind of calm Mel had seen in the desert. You don't know me, Yusuf said, but I know what you saw. Mel froze. The room faded into silence. What do you mean? He asked cautiously. Yusuf smiled gently. You saw the desert dream, didn't you? The words in the sand, Mel's breath caught. It felt as if time had stopped. How do you know that? He whispered. The man didn't answer directly. He just said, some dreams are not meant for one man alone. They passed through hearts like light through glass. Then Yusuf reached into his pocket and handed him a folded note. These are the words you saw, the ones you couldn't read. Mel unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, written in Arabic, and beneath it a translation. The truth was always here. You just looked too high to see it. His hands shook. It was the exact sentence from his dream. Word for word, he looked up, but Yusuf had already walked away, blending into the crowd. That night, Mel didn't go home. He drove aimlessly through Los Angeles until sunrise. His mind replaying every detail, the desert, the scholar, the dream, and now the stranger who somehow knew it all. By dawn, he stopped at a small hill overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered under the morning light. He whispered to himself, you can't film this, you can only feel it. He began spending more time in silence, meditation, prayer, not in public but alone. He even began to practice small acts of discipline he had observed in the village, waking before dawn, washing before reflection, bowing in solitude, not as conversion, but as respect, remembrance. He once told a close friend, I don't belong to one label anymore. I just belong to the search for truth. But Hollywood doesn't forgive silence. Rumors spread that he had converted, that he was following a secret faith, that he was working on a film to reveal Islamic history. He denied nothing, confirmed nothing. The mystery deepened. In an interview years later, the host asked him, why don't you talk about it? People are curious. He looked straight into the camera, eyes steady. Because the more you explain truth, the smaller it becomes. Some things should be left between a man and God. That clip went viral. Some praised his courage, others mocked him. But behind that calm expression, he was carrying something far heavier. The memory of a promise he made the scholar before leaving Jordan. The scholar had told him, if you ever speak of what you saw, do it only when your heart no longer belongs to fame. And so he stayed quiet for years. But silence has a way of growing louder inside you. One winter evening, after nearly a decade, Mel returned to the Middle East. This time, not for filming, not for research, but for closure. He traveled without announcement, without entourage, just as before. When he reached the small village, he found it changed. The old scholar's home was gone, replaced by a small mosque. He asked around, and a boy told him the scholar had passed away years ago. Mel stood there, eyes on the mosque's simple structure. The call to prayer began again, that same melody that had once pierced his soul. Tears filled his eyes, not as sadness, but as something deeper. Gratitude. He walked inside the mosque quietly. The men were praying. He didn't join, just sat at the back watching. Their movements were synchronized, their voices united. No hierarchy, no spotlight, just humility. And for a moment, he wished the world could see what he was seeing, not through a camera, but through understanding. When the prayer ended, an old man approached him. "You are the American actor, aren't you?" he asked kindly. Mel nodded, hesitant. The man smiled. "The scholar spoke of you before he died. He said, one day the man who came from far will return to Bao, not with his body, but with his heart." Mel's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, but his voice broke. He simply lowered his head, whispering the only words he could manage. Hay was right. He stayed there for hours, alone in that mosque after everyone left. He placed the Quran he'd carried for years on the floor before him, the same one the scholar had given him. He opened it randomly, and his eyes fell on a verse, "And to God belongs the East and the West. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God." He closed his eyes. The wind outside carried the sound of the adhan again, faint, distant, eternal. He whispered to himself, "It's all the same light, just seen from different directions." When he returned to the West this time, he was done chasing fame. He refused most projects, disappeared from the media. The world thought he had gone mad or grown bitter. But those who saw him in person noticed something different. A quiet peace, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. He began funding small humanitarian projects in silence. Wells in villages, schools for refugees, hospitals in war-torn regions. He never attached his name to any of them. But those close to him knew. It was his way of continuing the scholar's teaching. There's a story one cameraman once told years later. He had worked with Mel on a short private documentary, something never released. He said that during filming, Mel stopped and stared at the lens, whispering, "This isn't about Islam, it's about truth. And truth doesn't need actors." Then he turned away, walking off set into the sunlight, leaving the shot unfinished. No one knows what became of that footage. Some say Mel destroyed it himself. Others believe it's locked away, waiting for a world ready to understand. But those who met him in his final years all said the same thing. There was a serenity in him that no fame could fake. He spoke rarely of his desert journey. But on one rare occasion, when a journalist asked him what he learned from Islam, he smiled faintly and said, "I learned that surrender isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength." The room fell silent. His voice softened, barely above a whisper, "And I learned that God doesn't belong to us, we belong to Him." After that, he refused all interviews. He spent his days painting, reading, walking in nature. But every dawn, his neighbors would see a light in his study window. The same hour the call to prayer would begin in distant lands. It wasn't prayer and ritual. It was remembrance. A rhythm that had once found him in the desert and never let go. Years later, after his passing, his son found a small wooden box among his belongings. Inside was the worn Quran, the scholar's letter, and a folded piece of paper. On it, Mel had written, he said, "History is filming me. But I think it was faith all along. And maybe, just maybe, this was the only role worth playing." Set. The ink had faded, but the message remained, quiet, timeless, eternal. Some say the box still rests by his bedside untouched. Others say it was buried with him, deep in the earth, beneath the same stars that once watched him cross the desert. And if you listen closely on a silent night, when the world is still and your heart is heavy, you might just hear it too, that distant voice from the desert, calling not to convert, not to divide, but to remember. Because in the end, all he ever found was what the scholar told him from the very beginning, that the truth was always here. We just keep looking too high to see it.